Historalia are changing the game when it comes to putting on large history-themed musicals, hosting them in the grounds of historic buildings closely tied to the subjects of their plays. Their latest and very first British musical is just around the corner, and it's all about everyone's favourite Tudor MVP, Anne Boleyn. Anne Boleyn the Musical will take place in a specially designed theatre in the grounds of the stunning Hever Castle, Anne's childhood home. To discuss the musical with me, its inspiration, its casting and all that good stuff, I'm thrilled to welcome the director of the musical, Roxana Silbert, and writer, Rebecca Knight, onto the show. Welcome back to the Tudor Chest podcast, episode 95, Anne Boleyn the Musical, with Roxana Silbert and Rebecca Knight. Welcome to the Tudor Chess podcast, Roxana Silbert and Rebecca Knight. How are you doing?
Good, thank you.
Very
Excellent. So we're here today to talk about the upcoming Anne Boleyn musical, Anne Boleyn the Musical, which is going to be at Hever Castle, kicking off in just a few weeks' time. It's from a company called Historalia, and you're both heavily involved. Roxana, you're the director of the musical. Rebecca, you're the writer and co-lyricist. So
Yeah.
Before we get into that conversation, what do those roles actually mean in the context of the play? So maybe Roxana, if I come to you first, as director, what does that involve when looking at from a macro level, the musical itself?
Yeah, so I bring all the elements together. So I work from the script and lyrics and music. So we've worked quite closely together, developing the script, the music, and the lyrics in harmony, as it were. And then I cast the actors, and I structure the rehearsal periods, and I try and bring all the elements together: the lighting, the sound, the movement, so that my job is to tell the audience a story as best I can using all the elements that we have available to us. And obviously Hever, that plentiful and lovely. So yeah, I kind of have an overview job, as it were.
Yeah, you're pulling it all together.
Yeah.
Nice. And Rebecca, writer, co-lyricist, again, briefly, what does that entail?
Well, I guess it began with, hang on, what's the story? Because Anne Boleyn is a well-known story, and it's finding what version we wanted to tell. And so as the writer, it's my job to write the script. But as Roxana said, I've been working closely with Roxana and Pippa Hill in finding what the best structure is, and the best way to tell this story, and then finding where the songs should come, and then writing the songs, which I did the lyrics with an amazing man called Sam Kenyon, and then the music's written by an incredible composer called Sam Jeeves, and we've all worked really closely together to bring it to life.
Amazing. So a couple more, I suppose, fanciful, slightly silly questions, but if you could jump in a time travel machine and witness a moment from history, do you both have one?
I'd like to have seen the first conversation she had with Henry, when he's definitely got his eyes on her. And I'd love to have been her confidant, to hear her sort of journey and how she changes and how she returns to court, and to have an inside ear when she's away from court, and what she's actually thinking and what she's feeling, and whether she's going back to court feeling hopeful and sort of full of dreams of all the things she might be able to do, whether that's sort of social reform or whether it's excitement about being queen, or whether she's going back slightly begrudgingly or nervously.
I suspect it was probably a combination of a lot of it.
Yeah, so many feelings. Yeah.
And Roxana?
So I've been doing a lot of research around the period, and I find the whole. So I think what's extraordinary about Anne Boleyn is all the education that she brings from Europe and how she then applies
Yeah.
all of that at court. And so I was reading a lot about people like Francis Drake and them traveling around the world, and I just can't imagine what it must have been like. I would have loved to have been on one of those boats when they found this piece of land, which they realized that the world was not flat, and they found a piece of land, and then you get on it, and it's the Americas. And I've traveled quite a lot, and I find the idea that you would land and just you would be the first, person from your country to have been on that land. Quite extraordinary what that would have felt like.
You should read, if that sort of thing's of interest to you, you should definitely read. There's a book that came out last year called A Gentleman from Japan, and it's a true story about some Japanese men who visited the court of Elizabeth I. And you wouldn't think that was a thing or would have happened, but it did. There was this window, as I say, where some men from Japan came right across to England and spent time at the court of Elizabeth I. So that might be of interest.
I'd love to read that. Yeah.
So given that we're talking about Anne Boleyn, I would love to know if you've got a single question that you would ask her. What would it be?
So hard because we've been working on it so hard. We spend a lot of our time asking what's driven her. Why does she? We know what she did, but why did she do these things? And I would be fascinated to know what was driving her, what she felt her life purpose was. I find her fascinating, trying to work her out. I'd like to know what it was like to be her.
Yeah, and I'd love to spend time with her in Europe before she arrives, and to ask her how well did she remember her family? Maybe she's seeing them at the Field of the Cloth of Gold and, on the continent, but when she's coming home, does it feel like she's coming home? Where is home to her? Because we hear a lot about her being French and, there's no photos, there's no FaceTiming home, there's very few letters. So what does Hever feel like home? What feels like home? I'd love to ask her that.
Yeah. And a lot of that will also depend on whether she remembers much from home when she was in France and the Low Countries. A lot of that will also depend on when you think she was born, because there is obviously such division as to when Anne was born, with people going down the route of either 1501 or 1507, and that is a big gap. So that will have massively impacted Anne as a young woman, I think. So it'd be, that would always be, that would be my first thing would be, when were you born? Just clear it.
How old were you when all these massive things happened?
I'm very much team 1507, so I do go with the later date.
I've been writing with 1501 in mind, but it's, why? I don't know how you pick it.
We have a voice coach attached to this show who's going to help because the actors, they multi-role, so they play people from different countries. And we've been talking about whether Anne had or didn't have a French accent, and he's been researching it a lot. But just technically, if she'd been born at the later date, she may well have had a French accent. But if she'd been born at the earlier one, the shape of her mouth would already be set in such a way that she would never have lost her English accent. And it's just really fascinating, we won't know. Although apparently there's written evidence to say that she had great facility for languages and accents.
So as I said, we're here today to talk about Anne Boleyn the Musical. It's a production that's being put on by the company Historalia. Now, I appreciate you're both freelancers effectively working with Historalia, but before we dive into the conversation about this musical in particular, could you just introduce Historalia to me as an organisation? What is it that they actually do?
So it's been about 10 years, I think, where Simone, who had the sort of idea of putting on musicals in country houses. It began in Belgium. And I think he sort of began it thinking, I don't know if this is going to work or not, but he had a passion for musicals and history. And it seems to have been largely about sort of strong females as well. Not always, but the two musicals we saw were Marie Antoinette and Joan of Arc. And
Mm,
it's incredible because it involves the community. There's a community element of actors, and certainly in Belgium, seamstresses, and it's sort of about bringing these incredible stories to life in these historical settings, and certainly in the case of Anne, in Anne Boleyn's actual home. And there's something very epic and inclusive about it all at the same time, and this sort of thrilling night out under the stars where it starts in daylight, and by the time you hit the interval it's dark, and suddenly you can see flames or lights, or and the two productions we saw were fabulous, and I think certainly on the continent it's just been going from strength to strength, so it's really exciting to be a part of it.
And Simon speaks a lot about engaging the community, being able to engage with the history and with the houses. So they don't have a national trust in
right.
Belgium. And so it's how do you ensure that the local community knows your house and knows the stories of your area. So it's doing a lot of things at once, which is really interesting, which is producing amazing musicals. It's telling a history and it's engaging the community with the history of their
Yeah,
area.
and that's what I love about the process and the productions is the major focus on not only the figure, the central character, I suppose, but the venue is really central to this. It's central to the story. With that in mind, though, I mean, I would imagine that working in
Yeah.
such historical sites, it can throw up quite big logistical challenges, I would imagine.
Yeah, I mean, Historalia are building a 2,000-seater auditorium in Hever Gardens, and there's lots of things to think about there. I mean, amazingly, they're covered, so the audience are covered, so that if it does rain, they don't get wet. But it's things like
Mm,
where we also really wanted the castle to be in view for the audience because a lot of the entrances, I mean, the castle is part of the design in a way. And so you get a
yeah,
lot for free when you have an amazing space like that because the gardens, the river, the castle are all part of it. But so where to place the tent, the quality of the ground, there's lots of logistics about, I mean, getting 2,000 people in and out of a space has its own logistics. You know, where do you put the toilets? Where do you put the bar? How long is the interval so that you can come in, you can get from get to the loo and back again during the interval. And one of the biggest things we've had as producing a piece of theatre is that it's summer. And so it doesn't really get dark till 9 o'clock at night. And
mm,
interestingly, in Belgium, they would not start their show until 9 o'clock at night. But our audiences in the UK, I just because of trains and things, they just would find it very hard to go home at midnight. So we're starting at 8.
yeah,
So we've had to think about, I mean, Bex has had to think particularly about how to write the play in daylight because we don't have lighting really kick in until the second half. But then you're sort of looking at when sunset hits and all that sort of thing. And obviously, you have I mean, Hever's gardens are absolutely beautiful. And so
oh, they're stunning.
they're
Yeah,
absolutely stunning. And so it's about
yeah, they really are.
including them, but making sure that we're also looking after them and that in the bringing of 2,000 people in and out of that space and the construction that we're really honoring the space. So yes, it's quite a challenge. I mean, it's a big they start building on Monday and we don't get there for another 3 weeks. It's going to take them 3 weeks to make the space.
The reason I asked that is I actually spent 13 years in the events world myself.
Oh, wow.
And when you're working in venues as well, I mean, I appreciate this isn't happening in the castle itself, but you're working at places where every manner of listing will have been
Yeah.
applied to these places. So it's going to throw up its challenges.
Well, like you will know, it's about think of so we've got 50 people on site, so that there's 50 performers per night, and then there's all the crew and team. So there's probably about 70 people who all need to be fed, who all need to have somewhere to change into their costumes, and all those
Yep.
spaces have to be created, and the food has to be made, and the electricity has to be brought in. And I mean, it is an enormous challenge, and it's incredible what they've come up with design wise.
Based on that, let's turn our attentions to Hever Castle and the Anne Boleyn the musical itself. I take it as far as you're concerned, there was never any doubt it had to be told at Hever Castle.
Yeah. It was if I'd had an idea. And Simon, it was
Okay.
Simone knew that we had to tell Anne Boleyn's story at Hever Castle, and I wanted to tell a story about Anne Boleyn, and somehow the stars aligned, and we all got brought together at the same time, all wanting to tell her story.
And have you been working, I suppose, quite closely with the folks at Hever, like Owen Emerson and the people there as well?
Yeah, everybody's been incredible, and we've had a few sort of tours and talks, and they've all been amazing, and we've read their books. And Owen's been on the phone or on Zoom when I've needed him, and it's been really, really exciting to sort of I mean, sending a sort of early-ish draft to Owen was so terrifying in case he said, "This is absolute nonsense. I know
Yeah,
everything
we
about Anne Boleyn. What is this?" And so when he sort of got it and said, "No, okay, we're on the same page and we're seeing the same Anne." I mean, yeah, it's been they've all been amazing to work with, haven't they?
he's been so helpful, so helpful. And do you remember when we met, we saw the
Yeah.
sword for the first time, Rebecca? And we weren't, it's not the sword that cut her head off, but it is the same kind of sword, the
Yeah.
Flemish sword. And we hadn't quite clocked that, had we, that it would be that kind of sword. Things like that really impacted on the production.
Yeah, that sort of square-topped beheading sword that they have on display in the castle itself.
And why he chose a Flemish sword? Was it because he wanted to do it out of some form of love, or was it just the best sword, or why would you bring a sword from there to do it? It
I
was
sometimes wonder if it was also in his own way. I think he knew in his heart of hearts that she was innocent, and I think that maybe ordering the sword, there was an element of that because it is not a kindness that was given to Catherine Howard a few years later when her guilt was so much more assured. So I do wonder sometimes if this was also because the sword was said to deliver a much cleaner result. Maybe there was that
Yeah.
underpinning it as well that Henry kind of thought, okay, I know realistically this is all nonsense, so I'm going to make sure that her death is as clean as it possibly could be. There's maybe that to it as well, but again, we can't say for sure.
I was also wondering because I think I'd heard that the executioner had been French, and then Owen was saying, "We think he's come from Flanders," which was new. And I think I was reading something about that's how they were killing heretics in Flanders. So I don't know. And it's hard, isn't it, as well, when we talk about the sort of him being the kindness, and that's what we say.
Mm.
But at the same time, I've been very conscious in the writing of when thinking about the domestic violence figures and how women are still being treated now, and thinking how he treated his wife then, and whether and it's you just find it I find it very hard to think what was going through his
Mm.
head and how he sort of just dealt with the guilt. Or I mean, I hope he felt guilty, but then he proposes to Jane Seymour the next day,
Yeah.
so I mean it's extraordinary, really,
Oh,
isn't it?
it's crazy. I mean, there's 19 days divide Anne's arrest from her execution. So it's 19 days to destroy the woman that he spent 7 years trying to marry, is then married to for 3 years, but in 19 days he destroys her. It's remarkable the speed at which it all
Yeah.
happens.
Yeah, and but it wasn't you didn't cut Queen's heads off.
No.
I mean, or it's so wild, and which is why it's such a sort of compelling, fascinating story, because it's sort of too much to get your head around,
Yeah,
really.
it's one of those examples of fact being wilder than fiction. You just wouldn't have you wouldn't believe it unless we knew it had happened. How much of Hever will make its way into the show itself? You mentioned there that you want the castle to still be visible from the theatre.
So the brief was absolutely that the castle makes up part of the design. So people will have,
Hmm.
I mean, there'll be a very beautiful route that will be decorated through into the auditorium. And then what it the actual stage, although the auditorium is covered, the stage is open, and it allows us to work, to see Hever and bring people in from Hever. So it's a really important part of all the work that Historalia do, that is that the actual house is central to the design.
As we discussed earlier, this is your very first UK production. So to that end, Why Anne Boleyn? How did Anne Boleyn become the chosen subject?
I feel it's such a sort of we've been told her story so many times and often that she's the manipulative vixen who sort of seduced Henry and da 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 da. And I just sure it's interesting to have the grey area and those elements in it, or to ask those questions, but it just feels so sort of modern, that we're dealing with Brexit, we're dealing with leaving Rome, and it's sort of Me Too, how we treat women, or
Mhm.
a woman that's using her voice to speak out if she was very active in social reform, and how do we deal with ambitious women and power and motherhood? And there's elements of Meghan Markle and Princess Diana. And I just think there's so much to be had in the telling of her story that's as relevant today as, people have been fascinated through every generation about Anne Boleyn. And we still sort of love her. Some people find her divisive. I think it's just such an exciting story, particularly because it
Mm.
ends with Elizabeth and Shakespeare, and it's the ultimate sort of. There's some hope within. There's some redemption within this heartbreaking story. Ultimately,
Well, so originally, one of our executive producers, so we've got two executive producers, Simon and Eliane, and they're sister and brother. And Eliane has married into the Astor family, who owned Hever. And so she was actually married in the hall of Hever Castle.
Yes,
So there's a
yeah.
direct family link to Historalia, which is why Hever was proposed as the first British venue, because she's very nearby. And then it was the coincidence of interest between Bex's passion for Anne Boleyn and Hever Castle that sort of made this the play.
Bex, you mentioned there about Diana, Princess of Wales. I'm just curious, have you seen the film Spencer, in which Diana is visited by the ghost of Anne Boleyn?
no. Oh God, I didn't know about that.
Yeah, so the film Spencer that came out maybe 3 years ago, that Kristen Stewart, she got her first Oscar nomination for it.
Yeah.
A part of the storyline is that she's regularly visited by the ghost of Anne Boleyn because Diana herself sees correlations between her story and Anne's. So with that in mind, you might want to try and track down Spencer and give it a watch.
Yes, I'm going to watch it. I'm going to watch it this weekend. I didn't know. That's so
Yeah.
cool.
So you mentioned that about the fact that Eliane is obviously she's married into the Astor family. With this, was Anne always going to be the first choice for the first UK show? And you mentioned earlier about the fact that female central stories, Marie Antoinette, Joan of Arc, have kind of become Historialia's the way you go. So was to that end again when you're approaching first UK musical, was that always going to be the case? And was Anne the first choice?
I think so, because it just felt such an exciting story to tell in her home. That it felt like a
Mm,
very natural fit, I think. And because she's such a fascinating character, I think if you're, yeah, I think, and but I think also because Simone found Bex, and that was just a marriage made in heaven, really, wasn't
Yeah, it was written in the stars.
it?
It was meant to be because we were both thinking about it at the very same time, and a mutual friend sort of brought us together and said, "You guys must meet and talk to each other about Anne Boleyn." So yeah,
And I that meeting Rebecca was the reason why it sort of got green lit, as it were. That it was one of those gorgeous
and
coincidences.
Rox, you'd always been fascinated as well, hadn't
yeah.
I
you?
was fascinated by her. So Rebecca and I had worked together before, but as director and actor, and we'd had a long conversation about Anne Boleyn, hadn't we, one night
Yeah,
in the bar. So that was just a coincidence of interest as well, because it hadn't been that long before that we'd done a show together.
yeah.
What I've learned with no doubt whatsoever since creating my platform, the Tudor Chest, she is way ahead of the other wives in it when it comes to overall popularity, passion. The interest in Anne outstrips the other wives, I think, combined. And so anything about her story is always going to really draw people in. So As I understand it, the story covers her rise and fall. So obviously we know how the fall, what the fall looks like, but her rise can sometimes people can be a bit unsure about sort of when that starts. So to that end, if you're able to say, where does the story start?
It starts nearly at the very beginning um, of her sort of saying goodbye to Hever and her family, and off she goes to Europe, and we get a sense of the incredible women she meets there,
Hmm.
and Margaret Navarre or Marguerite de Angoulême, and her time in Flanders. It's we don't spend Queen Claude. Um, and we just sort of see some of her sort of formative years without spending very long there, but we see that, and then her return home as this sort of woman. So she leaves a girl and she's transformed as she reappears in the English court, a sort of relative stranger, really, with potentially a foreign accent, maybe not.
Mm.
But everybody wondering who she is, and obviously they know the Boleyn family, and then it sort of tracks the progression of Henry and Anne's relationship, and Anne's changing sort of views on what's driving her and what she wants and what she's trying to achieve.
I think the thing that's really important about that early moment is that it's the influences that she
Yeah.
brings back. So it's that she meets these extraordinary queens, but also she meets Erasmus, she meets all the kind of European intellectuals, and she's introduced to a different religion, and that's going to be really important when she comes back. But also, it's like fashions, for example. So she comes back, and she's sort of an outsider because she's come with a different education, much more ambitious than she probably would have been if she'd stayed in England because of the education, and also much more fashionable. So that she's a
Mm.
triple threat in all ways. And I think you said about her very much outstripping the other women in audience's interests. And I think it's because she was rebellious. She has a fire about her, and she has a like her self-determination. And I think that's incredibly attractive. And it didn't make her easy. But it just
Yeah.
makes her really sort of, she has energy, she has incredible energy as a woman.
Yeah, I think those 7 years that she spends on the continent, I think they are what molds the woman that she becomes. I absolutely believe that that window is what shapes her, and that her return to the court in 1522, that's when she does come back, and she comes back a different woman, and she comes back a woman that does just stand out. And I think that's a huge part of why what her allure was, really.
I think that's why Rebecca was so keen to put the childhood in, because that it was such a formative period, and it's absolutely that's how the play evolves, is that she comes back with a whole set of ideas that are new.
And having seen powerful women who are maybe not afraid to use their voice, and you feel like that's some of the allure to begin with, and then maybe Henry doesn't like it, or he's not. It's ultimately, isn't it? Because he wants the son, but the sheen or whatever it is sort of wears off. I mean, there's so it's a lot to unpack. But I think definitely that there must have been a draw because she's not afraid to speak her mind and say what she thinks, or what needs to be said.
Yeah. Anne's greatest power was that window, really, when in the early years of her relationship with Henry. Because as you've said, once she marries the king and becomes his queen, it's a very different position for her because also what she was and how exciting she was for Henry is because she isn't his wife. The moment she becomes his wife, what he's really looking for is Catherine of Aragon 2.0, just younger and more fertile. And I think that switch in Henry's mindset would have absolutely been there and would have been really difficult for Anne to marry up to sort of figure out how she then shifts from Anne, not mistress to the king, but kind of what that meant versus his queen.
And I think we sort of talk about her pushing for the poor law, perhaps with the help of Cromwell or Cranmer, except for we have Matthew Parker, who goes on to be Elizabeth's Archbishop. We'll focus on him more. And I think it's sort of figuring out how you can continue to push for those things when you haven't achieved the one thing you're supposed to deliver for the stability of the country.
Totally agree. Had she delivered sons, I think she'd have been given, because when she does all the poor houses with the charity work that she does, all of that's great and it's what's expected of a queen. But I do think a big part of Henry would have been going, you should be focusing on the main job. You haven't delivered a son. I need a son. So I think had she done that, it would have made her ability to, it would have made her queenship unassailable. She would have been secure. But I also think she probably wouldn't have been. I think we wouldn't be talking about her nearly as much as we do.
Yeah.
Had her story not ended the way it did. I think that's also something we have to take into consideration.
No, and the drama is there. I mean, the misalignment between what she wants to achieve and actually what Henry needs her for. That's a lot of the drama of the play, I think.
Well, you mentioned that the play is going to be via Anne's own perspective on the court. That's going to be central to the storyline. So can you walk me through a couple of ways in which that will manifest? What are the themes that are going to be explored, I suppose, specifically from Anne's state of mind and how she sees the court?
I can talk about it from a production perspective. I mean, there are moments, where I think there's a song out at the moment that you can get on Spotify, which is the moment that Elizabeth is born. And it encompasses exactly what you're saying, Adam, which is it's a political disaster, but she can't help but fall in love with this child. So she is a very adoring mother. And so that tension that she lives as a woman who needs to really, to fulfill her duty, has to bear a son, but who absolutely adores her daughter. So I think the idea of her as a mother is really important. One of the aspects of the production is that every single member of the audience has headsets. So the music is not live. The music is recorded by the National Symphony Orchestra of Prague. And we are working with two sound designers who do something called binaural sound, which basically means 3D sound. And you are able to experience people's thoughts as if they're right next to you, as if they're whispering in your ear. So quite a bit of this, we see Anne's perspective, but we experience as an audience, we experience Anne's point of view because it's like we're her best friend. And that's what that technology allows. And I think that will really help us feel very close to her, because although the space is very big, our experience of the musical will be very, very intimate and quite individual, because you will feel like she's sitting beside you. So I think that will be really looking forward to that.
That sounds amazing.
And also, it's Anne's story and she drives it. Yeah. I think that's something Rebecca's done amazingly. So what you do is you chart. So when she gets to that moment and she's had Elizabeth and she's had a girl and she realizes that her power is slipping away, she has to find new strategies and new ways of doing things. And we're much more focused on how it's like, what is it like to be in her shoes and try and navigate this very choppy political water? And the play is much more focused on that than it is on Henry and Cromwell's reactions, for example. So we're very much with her as the central character and as the driving force. What do you think, Bex? That's fair.
Yeah, definitely. And it's sort of, watching how she has to fight or sort of seduce or respond, and how I like that everybody talks about it probably, but how at the first fancy dress ball, she's perseverance, and she certainly does keep trying to the end. And you feel even at the end, when she doesn't slag off Henry necessarily, that in itself is her actively trying to protect Elizabeth. And so, yeah, it's about how she's going to achieve what she needs to for her and for her daughter and her family when everybody's sort of circling around her. And she's aware that lots of people are not fans of her and the massive changes that are ensuing, religious on the continent, wars, books, which is a bit like social media. Ideas are flying much quicker suddenly because we have the printing press, and it's just fascinating sort of watching her navigate it.
Yeah, and that was a big part of her identity. I mean, it was well documented that once she became queen, she had the English Bible in her rooms, open on almost like a lectern. She had the English Bible open and freely encouraged anyone who wished to do so to peruse it and to take a look. She wanted people to see the English Bible. And I think that's going to be that was a big part of her identity. And
Yeah.
you also briefly touched on there about the fact that she doesn't slag Henry off in her execution speech, but that speech is a masterpiece because she also is able to, by saying the words "judge the best" when she gives, that is telling the audience, that is telling the people that were witnessing
Yeah.
the execution, I want you to think logically here. I want you to judge me based on the best possible outcome. So that's a very clever way of actually saying I'm
Yeah.
innocent. And people would have understood that. People would have got where she was trying to send them.
Mhm.
People would have understood it.
I mean, in a way, sort of going back to one of your first questions of what would you have asked her, it is how the hell did you stay so calm? You know you're about to die, and that
Yeah.
she could stay composed enough to say what needed saying. It is incredible. And I love that judge the best.
Yeah.
That's in the play, and Owen spoke about that as well. And I think it's really key to her story.
Do you do you hope to challenge people's perceptions of Anne in some respects?
I think so. I feel like everybody's sort of is shifting a little bit anyway. I feel like there's been, lots of historians have been speaking about, hang on, can we see Anne in a different way? But I do think it's that sort of growing up with the whole divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived trope, and just sort of thinking about
Yeah.
her as though she, I love the musical Six. It's great, but she's still the vixen. She's still sort of the seductress. And it's just, I
Yeah.
think we can look at her in a different way, and I think hopefully we've got a sort of slightly fresh retelling of. I think because we're just focusing on Anne, we can just tell her story in a slightly different way. Because, I loved Claire Foy's interpretation in Wolf Hall, but again, by the time we meet her,
Same.
she's cornered. So we're seeing a sort of she's not light by the time we meet her. She's dealing with a lot of heaviness. So we get to see a slightly different Anne, I think.
So introduce your leading lady to me. Who is going to be playing Anne?
So our leading lady is an actress called Emily Lane. She's quite young. It was incredibly hard to cast because one of the things we realized is that Anne Boleyn is extraordinary for a reason. And so, finding an extraordinary performer was a challenge. And again, it's a triple threat that you need because she's in absolutely every scene. So she really holds the play, the piece together. And you might have seen her. She was in, I'm going to forget the names. Oh yeah, she was Hello Dolly. She was Minnie Fenn, Hello Dolly, and we'd both seen her in that. And she was Anna in Frozen as well. So she's had experience of sort of holding big stage. And we're really excited to work with her. And her voice is absolutely beautiful.
And she has got a je ne sais quoi, which you need your Anne Boleyn to have. And she's a talented actress and incredible singer. And yeah, she's brilliant. And Hello Dolly was one of the best things I'd seen. So then when we saw Emily walk in, I was like, yes, she's just great. She's great.
Amazing. And it's Anne's story, but it's also a bit of an ensemble piece. You mentioned that the cast play other roles as well. So who can audiences expect to also be seen being portrayed?
Yeah, we've got Henry VIII, we've got Catherine, we've got Mary, Cromwell, Wolsey, Erasmus, Holbein, the Queens, Margaret and Queen Claude, George Boleyn, Norris, Smeaton, who is the musician that dies, is also killed. Who else have we got? Oh, Elizabeth the First, obviously.
And we've got a slight invention. We've got Joan, who is she sort of serves the she's similar to the nurse in Romeo and Juliet. And when I went to one of the Holbein exhibitions, I was thrilled to see Joan because I'd already sort of we'd invented her. But yeah, she's a fun part played by Kim Ismay.
We have various of the bishops as well. So there's Bishop Fisher, isn't there? So it's really peopled. That court is very peopled.
Henry VIII is Mark Goldthorpe, and he's you wait till you see him as Henry. I mean, everybody's great, but he's sort of spot on, isn't he? He's in a good way. He's great. I'm really excited. We're very lucky.
Yeah, I'm so excited. I can't wait to see it. And costuming is obviously, it's always important in anything, any period piece. It helps set the scene. Anne was famous for her fashion sense. So what can you tell me about your costume designer's process I mean, I appreciate it's not the role you're directly involved in, but I'm assuming you work with the costume designers.
Yeah, so we work very closely together. So we went to the National Portrait Gallery actually, and we just walked around all of the Tudor. And we also, the designer and I had a tour with Owen so that we looked at all the fabrics and again all the paintings. So it's very much a period costume, very much informed directly by what we think they were wearing. And also not just that, but the textiles in Hever are amazing. So, and obviously textiles were so important in that period. So there quite a lot of those textiles are reflected in the stage design. And then it's about how to make sure that the audience understand Anne's fashion, because she came with a very different fashion from France and what the English ladies were wearing at court, and then watching that fashion evolve through that period. So most of the costumes are coming from Angels, which is a really famous costuming house that basically costumes every period piece ever. And it's always, there's the real thing, and then there's the performer, and then there's making sure the performer looks brilliant in the costume that looks as much like the original as possible. So that's the way we're going with it. But they also have to be able to dance and ride horses and, move easily in them. So it's costuming is quite a large part of it.
Yeah, it's massive. And based on what you said there, then it's going to be as accurate as it's possible to be, which I'm pleased to hear, because it's one of those things I feel like it's easy to get the costuming right, provided you follow what we see in the portraits, when we look at the records of what the materials they were using. So when I see really glaring, huge errors in costuming, I find it a bit baffling, I guess.
Yeah, no, Robert, the designer's very keen on making it as historically accurate as possible. I mean, we also have, because we have in the cast, we have 11 professional actors, but then every night we have an additional 40 community performers who play the townspeople, the court, all the sort of additional parts. And so actually we're looking at about 100 costumes per night. So
wow.
And the community have to play people at court, but then they also have to be able to play the people in the street or the monks or the Privy Council. So they're actually having to find 4 or 5 costumes for them. So it's a very big job.
Are there, I mean, again, you may not be able to say, but I'm curious, are there plans to maybe have any further musicals in the UK, looking at other big female figures from British history?
I think this is the beginning. I don't think this is a one-off. So I'm not quite sure what next, but I think this is just the start. Is the plan.
Yeah. So my final question for you then is, what do you hope is the biggest takeaway, I suppose, of Anne's story that people will leave with?
I mean, it's hard because I don't know how much I can say about sort of what I've written, but in a way it's about sort of saying, take up the flame and, the love or the the sort of togetherness that we can pass down from generation to generation, I think is maybe the underlying message. And that, even if there's a struggle, you keep going. And even if that person doesn't achieve it, then the next generation achieves it. Sort of about women's suffrage and, that's the sort of underlying message. But it's also a fun musical that is quietly political, I think. But yeah, it's sort of about, I think in a way, the heart of it, there's a lot about a mother's love and ambition and what we can achieve when we work together, I think.
Amazing. Well, thank you very much for coming on the podcast and having a discussion today. So for people who want to book their tickets, I take it you can now. Tickets are live?
Yes, they're on Hever Castle's website and Historalia.co.uk's website as well.
And the first performance is on the 2nd?
2nd of August. Yeah. And you can listen to Emily Lane singing You. It's out there now on sort of Apple and I don't know where but it's out there. You can find it.
It's out there.
Yeah.
Wonderful. All right. Well, thank you again very much for coming on the podcast and we'll speak soon.
Yeah, thank you so much.
That brings us to the end of this week's episode of the Tudor Chest podcast. Thank you for listening and a big thanks to Roxana and Rebecca for joining me. Next week, a week later than advertised, I'll be chatting to Helen Carr in part 2 of our discussion on her latest book, Sceptred Isle, this time focusing on all the dramas of Kings Edward III and Richard II. To stay up to date with all things Tudor Chest, please do give me a follow on Instagram, where you can also message me with podcast episode suggestions. I would love to hear from you. Thank you again for listening to the Tudor Chest podcast and chat to you next week.